And we shall finish postmodernism. Oh boy. Section 5. The world view. We define a worldview as a pattern of ideas, beliefs, convictions, and habits. A worldview shapes what we pay attention to and what we ignore. What we believe and what we pay attention to can cause us to interpret the world in a certain way. Postmodernism claims to point out these things. It is an analyzer of these interpretations, not a generator making truth claims of its own. Is it even fair to call postmodernism a worldview? Honest postmodernists say yes, because they realize that the tools used to interpret the interpretations of others comes from someplace. They too are situated in any given postmodernist's ideas, beliefs, convictions, and habits. Postmodernist author Walter Truett Anderson is one who acknowledges this and says that postmodernism is one of 4 worldviews operating in the West today. Some worldviews begin with claims about reality. Reality is God and His creation, or reality is consciousness, or reality is the primacy of the individual self. Other worldviews form as critical stances, reactions to other dominant worldviews. Marxism, for example, formed as a reaction against the biblical view of God, the duty of man, and stewardship of property. In this way, postmodernism is like Marxism. In the beginning, postmodernism was primarily a critical stance, a rejection of dominant worldviews. But, like Marxism, postmodernism couldn't sustain itself as a mere reaction. It had to build something and answer important questions. The principles of postmodernism, then, have been applied to everything from literature to political science to architecture and music. Over time, as Daniel A. Farber and Susanna Sherry argue, postmodernism has become a robust way of thinking about everything, and they say, postmodernism is a powerful and coherent mindset. It provides a philosophical outlook, a legal reform program, and a set of governing metaphors, all in one convenient package. This package has the added benefit of resonating with ideas that are popular in other parts of the academy. If one has doubts about the social construction of truth or merit, one can rest assured that the matter has been settled in the impenetrable prose of some esteemed French philosophers. So postmodernism is more than a critical stance, and later in this book we will discern identifiable postmodern patterns of thought in each of the 10 disciplines we'll consider: theology, philosophy, ethics, biology, psychology, sociology, law, politics, economics, and history. These patterns are clear enough that we can predict with a fair degree of accuracy what postmodernists will say or do about new things that come along. Let's look at postmodernism's patterns next, starting with its understanding of general revelation. Section 6. Christian author Nancy Pearcey relates the following first-hand experience. I witnessed a fascinating altercation at a conference at Boston University on science and postmodernism several years ago. Postmodernist philosophers led off by arguing that there are no meta-narratives, meaning no overarching universal truths. Responding on behalf of the scientists was Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg, who replied, "But of course, there are meta-narratives. After all, there's evolution, a vast meta-narrative from the Big Bang to the origin of the solar system to the origin of human life. And since evolution is true, that proves there is at least one meta-narrative." To which the postmodernist philosophers responded, ever so politely, "That's just your meta-narrative. Evolution is merely a social construct," they said, "like every other intellectual schema, a creation of the human mind." Some evolutionists agree with this. Daniel Dennett, for example, says that if naturalism, only nature exists, is true, then things do not have their own essence. Any idea of essence is just what we make up to describe the world to ourselves. To Dennett, we cannot directly access the world as it actually is, so all we can hope for is to interpret what we observe as accurately as possible. It sounds bizarre to say that we can't know or even observe actual truth. Aren't there some truths we can all agree on, such as 1 + 1 = 2? or stepping on the highway in front of a tractor trailer moving at 65 miles per hour will get you flattened. If postmodernists don't see it this way, we can actually say that they have a view of general revelation of things known to be true regardless of culture or life experiences. I think I read that wrong. If postmodernists don't see it this way, can we actually say that they have a view of general revelation of things known to be true regardless of culture or life experiences? Some postmodernists see science as a form of coping rather than a reliable means of gaining knowledge. For example, Paul Feyerabend, a former philosophy professor at the University of California, Berkeley, wrote, "To those who look at the rich material provided by history and who are not intent on impoverishing it in order to please their lower instincts, their craving for intellectual security in the form of clarity, precision, objectivity, or truth, it will become clear that there is only one principle that can be defended under all circumstances and in all stages of human development. It is the principle, anything goes." Here is Feyerabend's view of science in a nutshell. In the history of science, many theories have arisen, been accepted or as established, promoted as the truth, and then eventually discarded. When a scientist promotes a scientific data in support of a theory, that bit of data is anything but neutral because the scientist is biased. He can't see it any other way, even if his perception of the data fails to correspond to the characteristics of the data itself. If he's a powerful person and refuses to acknowledge that he is wrong, then it becomes a power play, and his agenda is no longer the pursuit of truth, but gathering support for his biased views. In all fields of science, questions remain open as scientific theories are regularly tweaked, and to top it off, the scientific establishment is very much politicized. Scientists are just as messed up as the rest of us. Doubts about the objectivity and neutrality of science arose in the mid-1900s from Michael Polanyi's Personal Knowledge and Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn, for example, pointed out that science is not merely a progressive and incremental discipline for the study and recording of facts. So-called facts can be understood and interpreted in a variety of ways depending on the worldview assumptions of the scientists. In addition, Kuhn asserted that scientific theories or paradigms do not often fall out of favor because they are proven wrong. Rather, older theories tend to die out along with their proponents, while new and creative theories attract the attention of younger scientists, who in turn promote their theories over the older ones. A current scientific theory is just that, a current theory which will be replaced by another current theory in the future. This is why science cannot tell us what is real, only what scientists believe to be the case at a particular time in history. Everyone, including the scientists, is locked into their particular cultures and languages and thus cannot claim to have an objective picture of the world. Even mathematics is not immune from postmodern analysis. Doubts about the objectivity of math were brought to light with Douglas R. Hofstadter's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid, published in 1979. I don't do German very well. The author of another text, Ethnomathematics, a multicultural view of mathematical ideas, Marcia Asher, asserted that much of mathematics education depends upon assumptions of Western culture. For example, she wrote that no other culture need share the categories triangle, right triangle, hypotenuse of a right triangle. Asher wondered, is a square something that has external reality, or is it something only in our minds? I got lost there for a minute, sorry. In our chapters on Christianity and secularism, we critique science for its unwarranted claim of providing certain answers to life's questions. But the postmodernist critique goes far beyond this, claiming that because our observations are culturally and linguistically situated, the knowledge we gain from science does not ultimately help us understand the world as it actually is. Whereas Christians might point to the sin nature to explain how our careful attempts at scientific knowledge can go wrong, postmodernists don't think theories go wrong because they're flawed. They go wrong because truth theories are impossible. Reality is not accessible to us. When we try to access it, we're just interpreting it, and our efforts to nail down truth are just interpretations of our interpretations. Of course, though, no one can really live as if nothing can be known, including postmodernists. They quarrel with one another when they think their arguments have been interpreted incorrectly. They still drive across bridges constructed through principles of science in cars engineered for safety and efficiency. If muggers attack them, they'll complain if the police don't come to their rescue. At the end of the day, we might ask whether postmodernism is something we should really be paying attention to, or whether postmodernists are just ungrateful whiners who should be ignored. Knowing what you already know about postmodernism, though, you probably suspect that it isn't that simple. Postmodernists do believe they have insight that enables them to approach life's ultimate questions. It is to these presumed answers postmodernism's version of special revelation that we will now turn. So, Section 7, Special Revelation, Postmodernism's Answers to the Ultimate Questions. In our chapters on each of the 6 worldviews, we have focused on how proponents of those worldviews answer life's ultimate questions. How do they know their answers are actually true? General revelation says some things can be known because they present themselves to us directly through observation. Postmodernists may say all ways of knowing are tainted, but don't they still make actual claims about the world? On what basis do they make them? If they make them from their particular standpoint, but act as if they should be generally applied, then they are being inconsistent. Anytime postmodernists speak to the issue of government debt or traditional marriage or the rightness of a particular military action, they are being hypocritical in assuming that their particular viewpoints should affect our perceptions. Our question should be, and politely said, why should we assume that your particular viewpoint has any meaning for anyone else? If they answer that question, write down the answer. It is the expression of what they believe to be absolute truth. On what sources of revelation does postmodernism draw? Postmodernism is in many ways the height of hypocrisy. If it were true, we could never know it to be true. Its sources of revelation are mostly whip-smart professors, Michael Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Richard Rorty, and Martin Heidegger, Jean-Francois Lyotard, John Baudrillard, Jacques Lacan, Stanley Fish, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and others. Most of these men had an extensive working knowledge of philosophy, literature, and even religion. But should their ideas be trusted? If all ideas about human reality are social constructions, as Walter Truett Anderson claims, then why would we, or even Anderson, believe Anderson's own claim? Such a statement, which incidentally is a propositionally framed statement of absolute knowledge, would make no sense to someone whose cultural background and life experiences were different from Anderson's. But every one of these authors wrote and published books and articles on the assumption that people would understand them. Why would they do this? It contradicted everything they taught. Jacques Derrida at least clearly understood the kind of world postmodernism was ushering in, and declared his intention not to be among those who let their queasiness get the better of them. Postmodernists, Derrida claimed, turn their eyes away when faced with the prospect that ours is the species of the non-species, in the formless, mute, infant, and terrifying form of monstrosity. Social construction is like an onion. When you're done peeling, there is nothing left, no truth that we can perceive, no enduring conception of what it means to be human, no access to what is real. Postmodernists have trespassed into territory Gorgias might have feared to tread, and Nietzsche saw only as he wavered back and forth across the boundary of what we now know to have been syphilis-induced insanity. A world devoid of ultimate meaning or purpose does not make itself easily accessible to a coherent worldview, and anyway, there would be no point. What does postmodernism say about humanity? In other words, what's wrong with us? In their book about postmodern economics, David Ruccio and Jack Amariglio Ameriglio, we'll go with that, make a startling statement. There is no singular and unique I. In other words, there is no self-identity and no permanent soul or mind. Postmodernists refer to human beings not as persons, but as subjects, bodies, or units. Person suggests the existence of a singular and unique I who possesses a personality or human nature. To postmodernists, there is no human nature. There is only an ever-evolving, highly sexual social animal with multiple subjective interests crying out for recognition and acceptance. So when Anderson says all ideas about human reality are social constructions, he's not just proclaiming the social construction of thought. He's saying we are socially constructed. We don't exist as persons. We don't have souls, but are a collage of social constructs. Mitchell Stevens builds on this stunning implication. It's not just that we each have different sides to our personality. It's that we have no central personality in relation to which all our varied behaviors might be seen as just sides. We are, in other words, not absolutely anything. But there's more. Postmodern psychologists are now asserting that there is no one self, but a multiplicity of selves. Kenneth Gurdjieff is a psychology professor at Swarthmore College. His book, The Saturated Self, Dilemmas of Identity in Contemporary Life, is considered one of the best introductions to postmodern psychology. Gurdjieff states, in place of an enduring core of deep and indelible character, there is a chorus of invitations. Each invitation to be also casts doubt on the wisdom and authenticity of the others. Further, the postmodern person senses the constructed character of all attempts of being on the part of both self and others. Okie dokie. Third question. What does postmodern say is wrong with us? Okay, that's what I thought the first one was. I'm just wrong today. That's what we're doing. Here we go. If we don't really exist, if we have no soul or indeed any identifiable self, why do we sense that there is something wrong with us and with the world? What is the nature of that wrong? Richard Rorty, one of the most well-known philosophers of the 20th century, believed the problem is adherence to meta-narratives such as Christianity. For Rorty, there was no room for obedience to non-human authority, meaning God. In fact, creating the new conception of what it means to be human was a matter of forgetting about eternity. Postmodernists have difficulty living with the rejection of universal truths. The statement, for example, "the train is coming," may convey a multitude of interpretations to different people, as good news perhaps, or bad news, or a metaphor, but we contend that if people fail to get off the tracks, the result of their interpretation may prove fatal. Real life is not open to infinite interpretations. There are, as even atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett acknowledges, brute facts in the real world. There are essences. There are boundaries. There are categories of meaning that exist independent of our ability to perceive them. At any particular moment in time, either a train is coming down the tracks or not. This real world fact is not a matter of our personal interpretation. Regardless of the word games, postmodernists have a hard time escaping the demand that our ideas correspond to what actually exists. Big question 4, what does postmodernism say about how we should live? Richard Rorty advocated abandoning the search for objective truth in favor of pragmatism, which is the idea that truth is not out there to be discerned. Rather, our experiences will enable us to generate a theory about living which we can use to understand our experiences. Rather than a quest for truth, Rorty suggested that the pragmatists strive for hermeneutic conversation. Rorty invited his opponents to dialogue with him to see if they could reach agreement, or at least a fruitful disagreement. He said that the hope of agreement is never lost as long as the conversation lasts. For Rorty, this use of language and dialogue was edifying philosophy, a chance to create some type of reality with the realization that we can never discover true or objective reality outside the boundaries of language, culture, and locality. Since there is no objective, universal, capital T truth, Rorty suggested that perhaps we can reach some type of agreeable or small t truth in order to get along with others. But does truth result from a conversation? Not really. Rorty's insistence on give and take and final agreement only sets the stage for another round of conversation where continuing conversation, sorry, I read that wrong. But does truth result from a conversation? Not really. Rorty's insistence on give and take and final agreement only sets the stage for another round of conversation where give and take result in further agreement or disagreement. Truth is never the result of continuing conversation because the conversation will never be finished or never end. How are we to understand other worldviews based on postmodernism? If postmodernism is accepted, the other worldviews we have considered must be discarded. Let's consider for a moment how postmodernists are likely to view each of these worldviews. Christianity. In The Twilight of Atheism, Alistair McGrath says the very idea of deconstruction seems to suggest that the idea of God ought to be eliminated from Western culture as a power play on the part of churches and others with vested interests in its survival. The insistence on absolute biblical truth is what leads to violence and oppression. Presumably, then, freedom from these absolutes would restore peace and balance. This is far off base. The three isms, communism, Nazism, and fascism, of the 20th century responsible for the slaughter of tens of millions were not exactly bastions of theism and Christianity. As a matter of fact, all three were grounded in atheism, evolution, and socialism. Three perspectives postmodernists carry around in the back seat, though they may not turn to look at them very often. Of course, there are self-proclaimed Christian postmodernists, such as James K.A. Smith, Brian McLaren, Meryl Westphal, Nancy Murphy, Stanley Hauerwas, and Alistair McIntyre, who reject the idea that deconstructionism entails the elimination of God. But even these individuals seem to consider biblical authors, like all authors, to be situated in their own cultures, experiences, and languages. What they wrote described their own subjective experiences as much as objective or eternal truths about God and humanity. These Christian postmodernists would surely recoil at the way postmodern ideas about objective truth created room for evil to flourish. But what do they have to say about our actual nature as humans? Are we merely bundles of relations and not souls? There are enormous doctrinal implications to this. For one, sin becomes redefined as the disruption of relationships. Our primary problem is not being spiritually dead because of our sin against God, but our incompetence in living in relationship with others. If this is so, the solution to sin is therapeutic. What we need is not to be rescued from the penalty of sin and the threat of eternal punishment, but to follow Jesus' moral example of how to live well with others. Christian postmodernism often begins with what some have called the hermeneutics of finitude, the notion that we are finite and limited in our humanness, so we must be humble or chastened in our claims to reality. That humans are fallen is certainly consistent with biblical teaching, but does it follow that we cannot understand reality? If we take this view too far, we might end up saying we cannot understand things Scripture clearly commands us to understand, in which case we make an idol out of our reluctance. This is not humility, it is stubborn sinfulness. Perhaps a better perspective is to say that we can know reality truly, though not exhaustively. Like a jigsaw puzzle, we can see the picture emerging even if all of the pieces are not in place. Imagine someone who is lost because he cannot match up what he sees in his surroundings with the description of the area he sees on the map. We might conclude that he is lost because his perspective is limited by his physical nature. He can't fly up to get a bird's eye view. But his lostness might also manifest in anger that leads to irrational thinking, embarrassment that leads to self-justification, frustration that leads to a stubborn refusal to stop and ask for directions. None of this, though, would mean that the proper route cannot be known, or even that there is no possibility of an accurate map. Ironically, by claiming that we do not have access to reality as it is in itself, but only as we interpret it, we set our interpretations, what we think Scripture means, and what we experience of God over who God has actually revealed himself to be in his word and in the world. This is far from a humble thing. It can, in fact, be spiritually dangerous. Islam. Islam comprises a meta-narrative purporting to explain all of reality. Postmodernism, while interested in how Islamic ideas developed and sustained themselves over time, has nonetheless rejected Islam's claim to objectively describe reality as it actually exists. This said, some Muslim philosophers have developed postmodern and anti-realist lines on the assumption that ultimate reality cannot be reduced to a series of statements we can know to be true or false. As more and more facts about Islam are called into question, such a line of thinking may allow Muslim thinkers to continue to assert the ongoing relevance of Islam as a rich source of cultural capital. The new spiritualist claims that consciousness is the ground of reality and that all life is merging toward unity, comprise a meta-narrative that, like all others, postmodernists reject. At the same time, however, some aspects of new spirituality bear a striking resemblance to postmodern thought. What Buddhists call the middle way, a school of thought initiated by a teacher named Nagarjuna, who lived around 100 to 200 years after the birth of Christ, suggests that things do not exist independently of our apprehending them. Things are empty of the qualities we consider to be existence, and as the Dalai Lama claims, emptiness is the ultimate truth. Middle way Buddhism and postmodernism have a lot in common. Secularism makes claims to absolute truth based in science and rationality. Paul Kurtz, in Humanist Manifesto 2000, described postmodernism as nihilistic in its claim that nothing can be known or communicated. Objective truth is knowable, Kurtz declared, and science offers reasonably objective standards for judging its truth claims. Kurtz saw science as a true meta-narrative. Science has become a universal language speaking to all men and women, no matter what their cultural backgrounds. As you might expect, postmodernism rejects secularism's claims. The meta-narrative secularism holds to be true, that objective reason based on scientific knowledge is possible, is the very claim against which postmodernism reacted in the first place. Marxism. According to Glenn Ward, the vast majority of mainstream postmodernists emerged from the Marxist atheistic tradition. Michael Foucault, for example, was at one time a member of the French Communist Party and at another time with a Maoist organization. Jean Baudrillard wrote, "Within a loosely Marxist framework, thinking it was his responsibility to bring Marx up to date. During its early years, Marxism promised of this worldly salvation for the enlightened irreligious. However, the passage of time and countless body bags led postmodernists to reject the Marxist meta-narrative while maintaining a similar understanding of class oppression. Postmodernism, as a wayward stepchild of Marxism, is now orphaned from its parent." Conclusion. Yay! Postmodernist Melville Herskovits wrote, "Even the facts of the physical world are discerned through the enculturative screen, so that the perception of time, distance, weight, size, and other realities is mediated by the conventions of any group." To which Hadley Arkes responded, "Happily for us all, this argument is fatally vulnerable to the recognition, accessible to the educated, the uneducated, and even at times to the overeducated, that there is a material world out there. That world happens to be filled with facts, or truths, that do not depend for their existence as facts on the experience or the subjective perceptions of individuals. Even if the enculturative screen of Jersey City affected its natives with fanciful perceptions of distance, the actual distance between Jersey City and Paris is very likely to remain the same." Arkes, a well-respected professor of political science at Amherst College, was onto something. Postmodernism isn't so much incorrect as it is fanciful at turns, pompous at others, and melodramatic on the whole. As this chapter draws to a close, let's take a moment to shed light on postmodernism's flaws so that those who find their pulse quickened by its self-portrait can bring their thoughts and feelings into balance. Postmodernism highlights important concerns but takes them too far. Yes, we can acknowledge differences between people groups, but these differences do not make it impossible to communicate even with people whose life experiences and cultural backgrounds are very different from our own. We can recognize that our experiences are a large part of who we are and yet make reasonable decisions about how to judge between competing viewpoints. Yes, we are shaped by our culture, but this does not mean we cannot perceive reality as it actually is. The Ferrari we talked about earlier does exist in physical space and time, and our perceptions of it can match the perceptions of others. Maybe we think it's cool because it actually is shaped in what can be generally acknowledged as an aesthetically pleasing manner. Yes, we ought to study the way language is used to manipulate people, and there are many instances of this kind of manipulation, but this does not mean all language use is therefore manipulation. Yes, it is interesting to trace the cultural roots of language and study how different traditions describe the world differently, but this does not mean the gulf between cultures is impassable. Postmodernism is not harmless. It will bite, but it can also be tamed. Postmodernism is blind to the true power struggle language brings about. If each community, through its use of language, determines what is true, then who decides between rival communities in conflict? Such as arose with sati, which is the Hindu practice of burning a widow on her deceased husband's pyre, or with exterminating the Jewish people through systematic genocide, or with socialism's goal to abolish private ownership of property. Since no community can claim to know what is objectively right, in these situations we have no real resources to draw on in opposing a person or a group of people, such as Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, who decide to dispense with our cultural preferences and do whatever they want. Even today we are witnesses to this kind of escalation between warring factions, from the college campus to the political arena to the international scene. Postmodernists contradict themselves. Take, for example, the phrase, true for you but not for me, or more consistent with postmodern thinking, you aren't in a position to know what is true for me. Either way, the postmodernist has made a statement her philosophy cannot uphold. If the person making the statement means to apply it to you, then you might properly respond, I get the impression that you think I should believe what you just said. If that is the case, why are you imposing your concept of truth on me? Some of postmodernism's self-contradictory nature can be seen in deconstructionists' approach to their own writings. D.A. Carson says he has never met a deconstructionist who would be pleased if a reviewer misinterpreted his work. He notes, in practice, deconstructionists implicitly link their own texts with their own intentions. In other words, deconstructionists believe in authorial intent when they are the authors, but deny that intent when it comes to anyone else's work. Postmodernism's view of personhood is unsettling. Jürgen Habermas is a respected German secularist philosopher who is concerned about postmodernism's rejection of what makes us human. Glenn Ward explains, Habermas sees postmodernism's apparent embrace of irrationality as morally bankrupt and believes that some sort of universally agreed upon framework is both possible and necessary in order to ensure that freedom and justice are achieved. Habermas disputes the claims of some postmodern thinkers that human identity is unstable, fragmented, or in process. For him, we all deep down share eternal human needs and desires. The failure of the postmodernists is that they refuse to propose a route towards the fulfillment of these. The idea of the self as nothing more than a collage of social constructions is at odds with what we know of ourselves and others. Is it possible we act as if human nature exists because it actually does? Postmodernism, when applied, can lead to grotesque results. For a telling example, look at the results of applying deconstructionism to law in the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, legalizing abortion on demand. In handing down their decision, the majority of the Supreme Court justices chose to look at the Constitution as a living document. That is, it's open to many interpretations. As a result, they invented new meanings from the original text, meanings that were not openly stated, and came up with a novel interpretation regarding a woman's reproductive rights previously unnoticed for almost 200 years. Since then, more than 50 million unborn children have been murdered at the request of their mothers. Babies have no essential nature, and therefore it is impossible to know what exactly it is we should be protecting. Misunderstanding the relationship between words and meaning casts us adrift in the often turbulent sea of human relationships. Confucius said, "When words lose their meaning, people lose their freedom." But there is a more serious consequence. As Michael Bauman points out, and as the slaughter of hundreds of millions of innocents in the 20th century amply demonstrates, when words lose their meaning, people lose their lives. Postmodernism can push us to hone our ability to communicate accurately so as to account for the textures and nuances and shades of meaning that make up human interaction. From the Christian perspective, though, this task is important not because it is academically amusing, but because our understanding of God's nature and character blossoms through the exercise. How so? The Bible's answer is clear. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. God is a communicative God, and He desires for us to communicate with precision and grace. This is exactly what He Himself has done in nature and in Scripture, which is why early philosophers deemed theology, the study of God, to be the queen of the sciences. It is the sometimes puzzling but always relevant discipline of theology that we now turn our attention. Woohoo!